Hello, and welcome back. So, I see a lot of people, and I mean many, many people, claim that having children is selfish. Selfish. And I agree. I do. I agree, but I don't feel like this is enough to acknowledge this. I feel like there's more worth getting into there. Because, it shouldn't take much. It shouldn't be difficult to acknowledge, to recognize that you look at the desires, you look at the behavior that very commonly leads to the creation of additional human beings. And it shouldn't take much to recognize that a lot of that is heavily driven by not only selfish desire, but very short-sighted selfish desire. Like in many cases, it's two people that just wanted to fuck. And that led to an accidental conception. And from there, they decided that, or at least one of them decided that it would be better to carry it to term. From their perspective, that was the better alternative. And there's a lot worth getting into there as to why that's, there's complexity there. But the point is, it shouldn't take much to recognize that, of course, oftentimes it's heavily driven, not even just by selfish motivation, but like just very short-sighted selfish desire leads to the creation of just so many human beings. Just throughout the entire spectrum of time there, again, like you see the conception that occurred and then carrying to term, and there's just not a whole lot of thought that takes place there in many cases. But I do feel it's also important to acknowledge that there are levels of selfish motivation that lead to the creation of human beings. And that would be, of course, one of the very low levels of selfish desire that led to just two people who wanted to fuck. That led to the creation of a human being. And that is many, many, many cases, that is what it is. That's what led to the creation of a person. But you climb up these levels of selfish motivation, and there's no escaping even just the most lofty examples of two people that intentionally, deliberately started trying for a child or children and had multiple or one children, and with the aim of raising their children really well and wanting them to go on to be the best that they possibly can be. Even this, it's heavily rooted in selfish motivation. I do feel it's worth acknowledging that when it comes to us primates, when it comes to us human beings, there's no escaping that entirely. When it comes to any action, really, you're not going to be able to escape selfish motivation entirely. It's just that you're going to have different levels of it when it comes to the creation of human beings. And I feel this I guess the main reason as to why I wanted to make this video was just to acknowledge the fact that, from what I see, many, many people who identify as being child-free do so when they're quite young. Many, many people who identify as being child-free, early 20s, mid-20s, oftentimes younger than that. And in many of these cases, and hey, you watching this, if you identify as being child and you're quite convinced that you're never going to have kids, that may be the case. I'm not saying, but it is worth acknowledging, I think, that in many, many cases, when people are rather young, they're quite convinced of this, and then they eventually have kids. And it's also worth acknowledging that in many cases when people do, I keep saying many cases, oftentimes when people do have children intentionally, it's later on in their lives when they've given it more thought, given it more introspection. And it's worth mentioning that who we are as individuals, our sense of self and what we want out of life, all these, they're quite likely to significantly change over time. And I feel that some people, when they're in their more younger years, would do a better job of preparing for the future, from what I've seen, if they knew for sure that there was a very good chance that they were to eventually have children one day. Many people behave quite impulsively, short-sighted. They're living for the moment. They're just indulging in the moment. And they do this for years, and then they finally have a kid or have kids, and they're not anywhere near as prepared for that action as they could have been or as they should have been. And I don't know, I feel this is worth acknowledging. I can think of one example in my own personal life of someone who has done this, just didn't prepare anywhere near as much as they could have. They had the ability, they had, and they still have a well-paying job, but they weren't doing what they could have done to prepare for that eventual action of having a child. And a lot of it was they were just convinced that they weren't going to have one. And yeah, I think the main reason as to why this is important to acknowledge, because many people who are child-free and identify as child-free when they're quite young, they'll talk about having kids as though it's this very selfish thing. And of course, yeah, like again, there's no escaping selfish motivations entirely when it comes to having children. But oftentimes people who identify as child-free in their younger years, they typically cite these equally, even more selfish, short-sighted reasons as to why they never want to have kids. They feel as though they'll typically cite superficial, selfish reasons as to why they never want to have children. And that, fair enough. But many of these things, as we age, our priorities will shift, and certain things will become more, in our eyes, from our point of view, will become more valuable, will take greater precedent. And that's a good example of what happens with many people. This shift in focus, getting further away from the more materialistic, superficial pursuits, and many people will go that particular route. And again, having kids, you can't escape selfish shit entirely, but it's worth acknowledging that many people who do have children, it's very, not only again selfish, but very, very short-sighted and selfish. And people who are, identify as child-free at these quite young ages, many of them, it is worth acknowledging. Maybe not you, maybe not me. I'm very, very confident that I'm never going to have a kid one day. I feel that way. Very confident. But the point is, we can't know for sure who we will be when we're 30, for example. There's no way to know for sure and of course, certainty will vary and uncertainty will vary from person to person. I guess the point is, there's a decent fucking chance, there's a very good chance, and it's a guarantee for many people who do identify as child-free when they're like early 20s, that they're going to eventually have children. And whether that'll be a well-thought-out decision or not, that's going to vary too. But it's worth thinking about. I feel like many people don't recognize in themselves just how greatly their sense of self, again, and their aims and what they want out of life will gradually shift over time. It's worth thinking about. Because I feel like many people would put in greater effort to prepare for the future if only they knew, if they were more sure of the fact that they were going to have kids one day, because many people don't even think about it at all for the longest time, and then they'll have kids and they just won't be anywhere near as prepared. Because people who are child-free, they'll often also, many people who are quite young and child-free will cite, like the difficulties of having to take care of a fucking infant. And that's worth thinking about, of course, but it's worth mentioning before, it's a very small window of time in terms of what your child's, if you were to have a child, that's a very tiny window of time in comparison to that full story, that full outcome, all the outcomes of your children's lives. So, point is, plenty of people who are quite young, who identify as child-free, are going to have kids one day, and they should give more thought to this. Maybe not you, maybe not me, but many. And it's worth thinking about. And I guess that's it. I just want to talk a little bit about that, because I see that quite often with people who are quite young. And it shouldn't be underestimated just how, to such significant degrees, what we want out of life can gradually shift, or very quickly shift. Really quick example. So I know woman who's now 30, just a couple of years ago, we were talking and she sounded so goddamn confident that she was never going to have kids one day, ever. She was so repulsed even by the idea from what it sounded like. And now she's 5 months pregnant. That's fucking insane. And she sounded to me so sure of her decision to never have kids. So it is quite something, the way in which certain factors will alter desires in terms of short-term, long-term, whatever, but it's worth thinking about. And that's a fairly common one, especially with women who are, as they get closer and closer to that point of no return, where you're far more likely to start dealing with fertility issues, for example. And again, I'm not saying this applies to you, but it is worth noting that for many women, this is a fairly common sort of thing, where they'll feel quite confident for the longest time, and then eventually they'll recognize, okay, it's now or never, and shit starts getting real. That's one way of putting it. Their priorities really do shift in a very monumental way, and worth thinking about, worth talking about. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. I'm quite confident that I'm never going to have a kid one day, but yeah, I see that. I see that as being fairly common, where people will feel quite confident of that at a young age, but then they'll do it and they won't be as prepared as they would have been, as they could have been, if they only knew that that was going to be the eventual decision that they would later make. So, I don't know. More people should think about it at the very least, about what it means to create a person and what you should do to prepare for that profound action, and just putting in more time, more effort to think about these things and to prepare for the possibility, and you get the idea. Let me know what your thoughts are.